Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
During the California gold rush of 1849, 3 men were holed up in a small cabin for the night. They sat around the jumping flames of the fire and warmed themselves. Outside, the wind whistled and moaned through the canyon. Every so often, a coyote howled. The 3 men were old friends who had shared the hopes and disappointments of gold prospecting. This was their last night out in the hills. The next day, they planned on heading to San Francisco to find work. All of them were broke. "Damn coyotes," Billy said. "We're lucky we found this place," Jeremiah said slowly. "They're hungry tonight." Another coyote howled above the sound of the wind. This one was closer. The 3 men looked at each other nervously. "I still don't like moving into deserted cabins like this," the 3rd man, named Dusty, complained. "You don't know why people left." He paused for a moment. "Nobody leaves without a reason." "Well, you can go out and sleep with the coyotes then, Dusty," Jeremiah said as he rolled out his sleeping bag. The fire was beginning to burn lower. The other 2 men rolled out their bags and settled down for the night. All was silent inside the cabin. Outside, the coyotes and the wind kept up their eerie symphony. Jeremiah woke from deep sleep with a start. He looked around, trying to remember where he was. The cabin. Yes, the cabin, he thought drowsily. But what had woken him? He lay his head back down and shut his eyes. Then he heard it. The breathing. It was fast, excited breathing, coming in short gasps. He looked over to the fireplace where Billy was sprawled out, asleep. Jeremiah's blood froze at what he saw. A face, nothing but the hideous face of an old woman, was hovering over Billy's body. The short gasps of breathing were coming from the hag's face. Jeremiah could see the lips opening and closing with the breathing. "Billy!" he screamed. Billy shuddered in his sleep. Then he raised himself to his elbows and slowly opened his eyes. His face was only 2 inches from the face of the old hag. Jeremiah watched as his eyes widened in horror as he looked at it. The hag's face was old and wrinkled. The skin was blistered by the sun and disease. Hair stood out on her head like twisting snakes, and her eyes were full of hatred. Jeremiah could hear its panting breath come faster. Billy parted his lips in a scream. Then the hag breathed a long, deep breath into his lungs. As Billy's body slumped backwards, the face disappeared. "My God," Jeremiah said softly. He didn't believe in ghosts, and his mind couldn't make any sense of what he had just seen. But that didn't make any difference now. He kicked Dusty with his foot to wake him up. Then he ran over to check Billy. But Billy was dead. "We gotta get out of here, Dusty," Jeremiah said. "Billy's dead. There was a face, an old hag's face. I don't know, it was a ghost or something." Dusty was lying on his sleeping bag, eyeing Jeremiah suspiciously. "You cracking up, Jeremiah?" he asked. But Dusty didn't say any more, because he found out what Jeremiah meant. The face materialized out of the air in front of him. Once again, the cabin filled with the sound of the old hag's breathing. Dusty's face worked itself into an expression of horror. "Keep your mouth shut, Dusty," Jeremiah screamed in warning, but it was too late. Dusty's mouth opened wide in a scream. The hag's face breathed death into his body through its withered lips. Then it disappeared. Jeremiah backed against the cabin wall. He looked down at his two dead friends. A coyote pierced the silence with its hungry howl. Jeremiah ran for the door. A foot away from escape, the hag's face appeared before him. Jeremiah's legs stiffened with fright. His hand froze on the door latch. The old woman's eyes were looking into his. He could see the pattern of wrinkles and scars on her face. He could feel her panting breath and felt himself choking. His breath seemed stuck in his lungs. The face was coming nearer and nearer. He struggled to keep his mouth shut. He thought of Billy and Dusty. He jerked aside the door latch and threw the cabin door open, watching as the door swung right through the hag's face. She disappeared once again. Jeremiah grabbed the rifle by the door and ran down into the canyon. He ran until he felt his lungs would burst. His own hard breathing sounds haunted him. It sounded like the breathing of the old hag following him. He kept running until the night broke into daylight. Finally, he threw himself down, exhausted, on a flat rock. For the first time since his escape from the cabin, he began to gather his distracted thoughts. Billy and Dusty were dead. Something had killed them. Jeremiah could still see the hag's hideous face in his mind. What was she? He wondered. The mad ghost of a prospector's wife seeking revenge? An evil spirit left by the indigenous people who had been forced out of these mountains by the gold rush? Or was that the face that death wore? And now that she had shown herself to him, was there any escape? Suddenly, Jeremiah realized how horrible his situation was. Someone was sure to find Billy's and Dusty's dead bodies, and nobody would believe his story about the hag's face. People would say he killed his partners for gold, and there would be no way for him to explain it. For a moment, Jeremiah thought he might go crazy. Then, he realized there was only one way out. He had to get out of the mountains fast before someone found the bodies. Far in the distance, he saw the dusty trail of a stagecoach. It was coming his way up the mountain. There was the answer, he decided. He would ride the stagecoach out of the territory. Jumping to his feet, Jeremiah ran down the canyon to the stagecoach road below. He had little time to catch his breath before he flagged down the driver. "Climb in, there's plenty of room," the driver shouted at him. As Jeremiah climbed into the coach, he saw that there was only one other passenger, a woman. He settled back into his seat and looked across at her. She was young and beautiful. He smiled to himself as he thought of his luck. Not only had he escaped the horrible death-breathing hag, but now he was sitting across from this charming girl. The young woman saw him looking at her, and she smiled shyly back at Jeremiah. As the stagecoach rocked slowly from side to side, Jeremiah's tense body began to relax. Everything will work out all right, he thought to himself, and he drifted off to a contented sleep. He woke suddenly with a start. His heart was pounding wildly. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The stagecoach. Yes, the stagecoach, he thought drowsily. But what had awakened him? Then he heard it. The breathing. It was fast, excited breathing, coming in short gasps. Jeremiah looked up. the young woman was staring at him. He saw her lovely lips opening and closing with the breathing. Jeremiah's eyes took on a wild look. He thought of Billy and Dusty. The breathing seemed to get louder. It seemed to pound in his ears. He crouched into the corner of the stagecoach. Desperately, he looked out the window. The coach was going around a hairpin curve next to a cliff that fell sharply to the deep canyon below. He looked at the woman again. She was still staring at him. Her breath was coming louder still. The whole stagecoach seemed to fill with it. "No," Jeremiah moaned softly. "Is there something wrong?" the young woman asked as she got up from her seat and sat beside Jeremiah. He shrank back against the stagecoach door. He watched as the woman's face came closer to him. She was lifting her hand to his forehead. He could feel her breathing against his face. "No!" Jeremiah screamed as he turned the latch on the door and jumped out of the stagecoach. His scream echoed up from the canyon as his body tumbled down the steep cliff. Then, the young woman heard no more. She sat sobbing in the stagecoach, terrified with fright. It was her first trip out west, and she just watched as a man that she'd never met before leapt to his death. It was the night guard's first night of duty in the Egyptian rooms of the museum. He had been assigned to work in the Viking room for many months before this. He plopped his large body down on a hard bench by the wall. His bloodshot eyes surveyed the room. There were huge stone sculptures of lions with the heads of men, and wall paintings filled with strange symbols. There were jars, clothing, utensils, and, what interested him the most, mummies and coffins. "I should have myself a good time in here," he muttered to himself, and then he let out a cackling laugh. The guard had a good time in the Viking section of the museum as well. That was the reason for his transfer to the Egyptian wing. No one had been able to prove he had done it, of course, but he knew he was suspected. It was worth it, though. He had enjoyed scratching that word into the old Viking stone and putting that cigarette butt into the mouth of the fake Viking warrior. There were other things he had done too, things that they hadn't even caught yet. He hated museums, always had, ever since his mother had dragged him through them as a child, and he didn't like being a night guard in this museum. But what else could he do? It was the only job he could find. Anyway, at least he could make sure that he wouldn't get bored. The guard heaved his heavy body off the bench and began making a slow circuit around the long room. After a few steps, he stopped in front of a huge wall painting. It was filled with weird symbols and pictures of people with animal heads. A woman with the head of a bird, a man with the head of a cow, another man with the head of a fox. There was also a bird with the head of a man, and a monstrous thing with the head of an alligator. "Rubbish," the guard muttered. But he stooped to see the title of the picture on the wall plaque. "The Seal of Judgment," it read. Underneath the title were these words: "The Egyptians thought that when a man died, his soul went before judges, all seated in a great hall. The judges wanted a report on the way he had behaved while on earth. Then the man's heart was weighed on a scale against a feather, the symbol of truth and justice. This was to find out if the man had spoken the truth to the judges. If he had lied, he was immediately fed to the monster with a crocodile head." The guard finished reading the plaque on the wall. Then he looked at the picture again. The scale was there, a heart on one side and a feather on the other. And the monster with the crocodile head was waiting beside the scale. The guard took a few steps backwards from the wall painting, but he didn't take his eyes off the crocodile. It fascinated him. "Does it scare you?" The voice made every muscle in the guard's body jump. He swung his large body around to face the speaker. It was the assistant curator of the museum, smiling. "I didn't mean to scare you," the curator said in a slow, measured voice. "I wanted to know if the painting scared you." The guard was embarrassed now. His embarrassment quickly turned to anger. "That old junk doesn't scare me," he said. "What do you mean sneaking up on me like that?" The guard glared down at the short curator. "I didn't sneak up on you," the curator answered in slow speech. "On the contrary, I walked quite normally. It's your job to be alert, after all." The guard didn't reply. He was seething with anger. "And furthermore," the curator went on, "this isn't junk. Our museum has one of the best collections of Egyptian artifacts in the world." "Doesn't interest me," the guard said, walking away from the curator. "I think it's junk." The curator's face went red. "We're on to your tricks, you know. If we weren't so short-staffed, I'd have you fired." The guard turned around and stared at the curator with an insolent look on his face. "You just watch yourself," the curator kept it up. "If you disturb anything in this room, you could be sorry. The Egyptians knew a lot about magic and curses and had great respect for their dead. You had better not try any of your tricks in here." The little curator continued his lecture until he walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The guard began his circuit of the room again. Now he had a surly scowl on his face. As he passed the Egyptian paintings and statues, he began to hate them more and more. The humans with animal heads seemed to threaten him with their beaks and claws and strange, passive faces. "You better watch yourself," the guard mimicked the curator's words. "They can have this job," he muttered. The guard stopped to pull out a stick of chewing gum from his pocket. In front of him was a wooden coffin. The sign beside it indicated that it belonged to a princess. It was in the shape of a human body. The coffin bottom lay flat on the floor. The decorated coffin lid stood upright at the foot of the bottom. As he began to chew his gum, the guard stared at the pictures on the decorated lid. The body of the lid was covered with feathers, human figures, snakes, and strange symbols. On top of the lid, there was a face, the face of an Egyptian woman. She had large, almond-shaped black eyes. The guard found himself staring into them. "Ow!" The guard had bitten his tongue while chewing his gum. The pain snapped him back to reality. For a moment, he had become lost in that woman's eyes. He put his fingers in his mouth and took out the gum. He looked around for a place to put it. Opposite the coffin was a mummy. It was the son of the princess. The guard looked at the mummy's human shape, wrapped in yellowing strips of cloth. He laughed under his breath. Then he stuck his piece of gum onto the back of the mummy's head. Now he laughed louder. But suddenly he stopped. He felt as though someone was behind him, watching. He whirled around, but no one was there. Only the coffin. The woman's eyes were staring at him just as before. The guard started to walk away from the coffin, but he found he couldn't take his eyes away from the woman's face. They seemed to be paralyzing his body. The first sickly feeling of fear crept into the guard's mind. He remembered the curator's words. They had magic and curses and respected their dead. Then he remembered that the mummy was this woman's son. The guard struggled to leave the spot where he stood. He swore at the coffin lid. He tried to reach out and knock it over, but he couldn't help himself. He seemed to be sinking deeper and deeper into the black eyes of the woman. Those eyes seemed to beckon him, to hypnotize him. They were like bottomless black pits set into the white, passive face of death. The guard found himself being drawn forward, toward the coffin. His brain was slowing down, becoming sleepy. As he came within inches of the woman's eyes, suddenly they closed. Instantly, his own eyes went toward the coffin bottom. He saw that it was bigger than it first seemed, big enough for him to lie down in. The guard was falling asleep. He let his body slip down into the soft, cushioned bottom of the coffin. He stretched himself out. With his hands by his side, his body fit perfectly. Just before he fell asleep, the guard opened his eyes once more. He looked up at the inside of the coffin lid, which faced him at the bottom of his feet. He saw the woman's face was painted on the inside of the lid, too. Her eyes were watching him, but these eyes were blacker yet. Black with revenge. The guard slipped off into strange dreams just as the coffin lid fell neatly down over the coffin bottom. He lay in darkness. Then, the airtight, eternal darkness of an Egyptian coffin. And somewhere, the monster with the crocodile's head was waiting for him.